Director of Communications with the 1882 Foundation. Our office is based in Washington, D.C. Welcome to today's event. It is called Timeless Echoes, the Failure of Asian American Studies. And as you may know, this is one of our series that we launched recently. And while the 1882 Foundation has been with us in our community for some time, our focus is really to share our stories, share our history, share our heritage, and bring important conversations on topics like today. And I'll pass it to Linda Nguyen in just a moment to formally introduce today's topic. So I first want to thank again everyone for joining, and thank you for our wonderful group of speakers today who will be discussing a very important topic. And also thank you to many of our community collaborators. As some of you may know, we work with many community organizations, including the Chinese American Citizens Alliance, OCA, the Chinese American Museum here in DC, and also the DC Chinatown Service Center. So thank you again to our community collaborators, and also a big thank you to the 1882 Foundation team for continuously putting together all of these amazing educational events. So without further ado, I want to pass it to Linda to formally kick us off and discuss today's event with you today. Linda?
Yeah, thank you, Elin. Hi, everyone. I'm Linda. I'm the Partnerships Associate at 1882. I'm just going to introduce the event a little bit. So as Elin mentioned, it's part of our Timeless Echo series. So in contrast to our Talk Story series, Timeless Echoes are intended to focus on a historical topic or issue and then sort of bring that to apply to the present and see what kind of echoes it has in our current time period. So hopefully you'll see a little bit of that connection between the past and present today as our speakers talk about their experiences with Asian American Studies programs at their various schools, how they were founded, their significance today, and hopefully we'll be able to sort of chip away at the question of, have Asian American Studies actually failed? And Elin mentioned that you can drop your questions and comments in the chat, but just so everyone knows, there is a Q&A portion at the end, so we won't be like answering questions throughout while the speakers are presenting, but at the end, I'll be pulling questions from the chat to sort of ask our panel. So to get started, I'm going to introduce our wonderful moderator, Franklin Odo. Franklin Odo was among the few faculty members when Asian American Studies was established at UCLA and served as a professor of ethnic studies, history, and/or American studies at several universities, from the University of Hawaii to the University of Pennsylvania, Hunter College, Princeton, and Columbia universities in the 1990s. He has published No Sword to Bury, Japanese Americans in Hawaii During World War II, and most recently in 2013, Voices from the Cane Fields, Folk Songs from Japanese Immigrant Workers in Hawaii. He has a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Association for Asian American Studies and a Distinguished Service Award from the Asian American Justice Center. He was the founding director of the Asian Pacific American Center at the Smithsonian Institution from 1997 to 2010, and the interim chief of the Asian Division at the Library of Congress in 2011. Franklin was appointed Humanist in Residence at the John Nicholas Brown Center for Public Humanities at Brown University in April 2013. He currently leads a theme study on Asian American Pacific Islanders for the National Historic Landmarks Project of the National Park System, and is currently John J. McCloy Visiting Professor of American Institutions and International Diplomacy at Amherst College. So without any further ado, I'll let Franklin take it away with our first speaker.
All right. Thank you, Linda. So this is very interesting topic and very interestingly posed. So those of us who have been in Asian American Studies and or been following it for the last half century or so, I think would have a lot to say. And I think our first speaker particularly is relevant to this topic. Laureen Chu was born in San Francisco to a Chinese American father and a Chinese immigrant mother. At San Francisco State, she was arrested during the 1968 Third World Liberation Front's student strike and spent 21 days in jail for her support in establishing the College of Ethnic Studies, which is still the only college of ethnic studies, by the way. Laureen became a bilingual second grade teacher in order to create social change within the community. She also worked on China's Missing and Dim Sum, pioneering films that explore a community point of view to counter stereotypes that were fostered and are still fostered by the dominant society. She joined the Faculty of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State in 1980, and later held a joint appointment with the Department of Elementary Education to assist in institutionalizing bilingual cross-cultural teacher training. In 2006, she returned full-time to the College of Ethnic Studies as Associate Dean. She retired in 2017 as Emerita Faculty in Asian American Studies. Laureen, you're on.
Thank you, Franklin. Well, how's everyone today? Thank you for joining us. And I don't know, I guess, it's a very provocative question, which is one of the reasons why I agreed to kind of say my piece in it. And I hope that at the end of this, I guess, end of our talk today from all of us and discussion, that you as an audience can, share with us your answer to this question, whether it's a yes or no, or another answer that is somewhere in between. That would be great, because I'm very curious. So my piece of it is basically a synopsis of why I joined the strike, and how it evolved into a career, and then later actually a view of life that has been a guiding force in terms of how I lived my jobs. Franklin already told you that my parents are kind of interesting. My father was born in San Francisco in 1905, and apparently my grandfather, his father, came in the 1870s, of which I just recently found out in 2018 when I went back to our home village, and I was the first one to go, and so far still the first one from our entire family of 300 some odd people of going back to China to see where we came from. My mom, on the other hand, was born in 1921 in Canton, China, and she came here as a picture bride because my father was in the armed forces, and he was allowed to sponsor a fiance. So that's the short of their relationship. Never met, never talked, got here, got married, and we're married until he passed in 1978. And then you can see that he was also a lot older than my mom. So I was basically raised in Chinatown, meaning that, Chinatown is what formed me in terms of who I was, the kind of teachings and values that were nurtured and taught at home were probably enforced in the community, and have, for 22 years, from birth to that age, it's going to have a strong hold on who I became and who I am today still. So I guess when I was in Chinatown as a child, from kindergarten through about high school, it was nice. You were able to basically be who you were, speaking Chinese at home. And then, and for myself, I didn't speak English until I went to school. There was no preschool back then. And what was interesting is that, we were taught always to respect authority, including teachers, and then also to get a good education so that we can, quote unquote, do better than our parents. And my mom was the primary figure in raising us. My dad worked at the family business and nightclub, and he was gone, he was asleep during the day and gone at night because he worked in the nightclub, right? And so my influence was basically from my mom and all my extended family, who were basically American born. So my mom was the stronghold in terms of the Chinese values. And because she was very proud of who she was and never apologized for being Chinese, that had a heavy influence on how I reacted, to schooling in America and trying to impose my values of my American schooling on her. Example, by the time I was in third grade, it was very clear that in our public schools in Chinatown, although it was 99% Chinese, that English was the status language, which is what the teachers pounded into us. Like if she saw the kids speaking in Chinese as we're playing jacks or something, the yard teacher would inevitably have a bell and ring it in our ears and say, okay, don't speak Chinese here. You're in American school now. And so we go, oh, okay, fine. We'll speak English, blah, blah, blah. So what was interesting is that my brother and I spoke English to each other. And then of course, when my mom wanted to speak to us about something or ask us the question, once that teacher told me that, I immediately went home and responded to her in English. And her response to me was kind of interesting. She goes, what did you say? In Chinese. And I said, blah, blah, blah in English. She said, don't you dare speak to me in that language because I don't understand it. You speak to me in Chinese. And I went, okay. And she was a force to be reckoned with. So you do not deny her wishes. Okay. So it was very clear from the age of 8 that I was going to kind of like, okay, how do I manage this? Home being a very strong force, and then schooling being another strong force, and then the dominant society imposing another force on me, which actually, reinforced what schooling did. And so I think, by the time I was about, even 12 or 13, and I was still going to school, public school, having American schooling in Chinatown. By then I was at a Catholic school, which was still predominantly Chinese at the end of Chinatown. But the interesting thing was that, there was a lot of code switching in terms of language in our community. You speak half Chinese, then you jump into English, and then you flip-flop back into Chinese, and it was not a big deal. At school, it was obvious that you had to speak English. But the other message is that you had to also be Chinese. And the primary force for us as kids at that time was I had to go to Chinese school. And that was 2 hours a day, every day, 5 days a week, of which I hated. And most of us hated because it was boring. And also it denied us the time to do our homework in English and for American school. But what was more interesting was to start to my image of family and what we were supposed to be was being altered slowly but surely by media and television, of which we saw, shows where, kids talk to their parents, like the Donna Reed show. Those of you who are old enough might know that. And the teenage kids would have problems and they would talk to the mother. The mother will always help them solve the problems, be understanding, love them, have beautiful homes. And then I'm looking at our place and I go, this is not quite a match. And then secondly, what was interesting was that the dynamics of family was not a match. The expressions of love, the expressions of care were kind of like diametrically opposed. My mother would never even think of saying to us, I love you, daughter. You're such a sweet girl. And you've done everything I've told you to. It's just wonderful. Are you kidding? Never. So the message and the desire for me was that I wished I had those parents because at least they heard what their kids are trying to tell her. So I knew never to say anything negative or, about especially adults or problems I had with them or even problems I had with other kids. It was always taught to us how to behave and we just followed, even if you disagree.
Laureen,
Yes.
I'm going to interrupt for a second. Well, I want to make sure you get to the strike.
Yes. So what happened?
So you have about 5 minutes.
Okay. What happened was that during my last year in high school, which was predominantly a white Catholic high school, there was 99% white. And at this point, I was like totally not accepted, which was very different than when I went to public school in Chinatown. And what was interesting was that I was different in terms of my other classmates. At that point in going to Catholic school, I didn't understand why I was not liked and why I was not accepted into the social circle. And other Chinese girls were okay. I didn't have the grades and I didn't have the sports. And what's worse was that I didn't have a parent that I showcased at school for mother-daughter fashion shows, for mother-daughter breakfast. People have to be kidding to think that I was going to bring my mom to school. She was totally not an acceptable model for me to have to match the other models of the white parents that dressed well, spoke well, and were quote unquote of a certain class. So by the time I left high school, I had this self-loathing of who I was, and I resented what I was, primarily being Chinese. I mean, it was termed and was labeled for many of us that time a very high sense of self-hate. And by the time I got to San Francisco State, I was totally ready for a different experience, even though I didn't know why I felt the way I did and was totally demoralized by it. So when I got to State, I have already seen Martin Luther King, Kennedy's assassination, the free speech movement, and the Chicago 7, all of which my parents and my community labeled as negative and as radical and as something you should not become. I, on the other hand, had so much anger and self-loathing. I was on a journey of finding out who I was. And luckily for me, I joined a group that happened to be a Chinese American group that was forming itself to be different than the other Chinese American groups on campus, which was primarily social. This group attached itself to being, quote unquote, part of a movement that the African Americans and the Latino communities had already started years before, which was to deal with the issues of their community. And in Chinatown during the late 60s, there was a huge influx of immigrants that didn't speak English and needed help, especially the youth. The youth problem was really exploding, including gangs. And at that point, many of the college students began to be rooted in the community, just as the Black students and just as the Latinos. And in fact, those groups had already used Associated Students Fee to help establish the projects. And it was that link between those three groups and their years of pleading with the administration, of allowing them to offer classes, allowing them to offer community service as part of their coursework, and actualizing the dream of like having education be the tool by which we all will learn something to bring back and serve our communities, which was totally unheard of at that point. And so I guess the frustration was exploded by 68, the spring of 68, where they had, we had huge meetings of the entire campus, of which people were, yelling at each other in terms of BSU and TWLF, yelling at the administration giving a variety of excuses of not being able to offer what we wanted. And so by the fall of 68, the students called the strike. And because we worked in the community and people knew our work and our communities were changing at that time in terms of the politics within there, and college students were key in terms of being the more militant and radicalized forces, enforcing the issue of like, we, especially Asian Americans, have been ignored. We want to be part of the federal funding. We have alliances with other groups that agree with us. So give us what we are due. That was the voice in the community. That transferred onto campus. And the interesting thing was that these groups, TWLF and BSU, had their own movement. We found common causes and the common goal. The common goals were very, very simple. One, our teaching and our aspiration is to get access for our community students to come to college, which started the EOP program as a result of the strike. And then secondly, when we give access to the students to come to college, we want to be some of the classes that we offer that spoke to their history and some of the truisms about who they are. And with that, and then also the last thing was that we wanted self-determination in terms of how to, create the college and what it was to become. Well, that strike was pretty powerful in terms of white students who were, quote unquote, the dominant student population supporting us, and which is very similar to what Black Lives Matter is, right? We were the minority, but the galvanizing piece was that all these students had already seen and understood the civil rights movement, and they were ready to kind of overturn and, de-emphasize the classic education and move on to a new type of education. And the strike actually produced the College of Ethnic Studies, where we were allowed positions to hire for 4 departments, which include Asian American Studies, Black Studies, at that time, Rasa Studies, and then American Indian Studies. And, for about 20 years, it was more about stabilizing who we were, in terms of a department and in terms of a college. And that is not easy. And those are separate stories about the fight to stabilize. Then the next thing is legitimizing, which has always been a struggle and continues to be. So, in terms of being it, it was just being involved. It just evolved. In terms of home teaching and being able to relate to society, it was never for me meant to be. It was somewhat of a discovery.
That's a great summary of a lot of the things that we had heard from. I was in LA at the time, and hearing about the strike. So this is probably a good segue to Russell's presentation. So I want to just spend a couple of minutes. Thank you, Laureen.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Professor of Asian American Studies at SF State University, Dr. Jung is author of several books and articles on race and religion, including Family Sacrifices, The Worldviews and Ethics of Chinese Americans, published recently by Oxford, Moving Movers, Student Activism and the Emergence of Asian American Studies, At Home in Exile, Finding Jesus Among My Ancestors and Refugee Neighbors. Professor Jung co-founded Stop AAPI Hate, which is probably the reason most people who are on this performance, this webinar, would know him, along with Chinese for Affirmative Action and the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council. Stop AAPI Hate has been on cable news recently a lot in the last week. So it's a pleasure to welcome Russell to this conversation. Russell, it's all yours.
Thank you, Franklin, and I'd like to thank the 1882 Foundation too for inviting us. I'd like to thank and honor Laureen and Franklin for being the original strikers and for upon whose shoulders we stand on, and for creating ethnic studies. It's a real provocative title. Has Asian American Studies failed? And sort of like asking, has the United States failed? And it's a great question that we have to keep on asking ourselves. What are the objectives of Asian American Studies? Are we meeting them? And how, like Laureen said, how has it evolved? Which is really the question. So actually, I wasn't planning to do this, but I'm going to quickly sort of catch you up to speed to what happened at San Francisco State, where Laureen left off with the establishment and the legitimization of Asian American Studies at our state university, how it differs at research universities like UC's, and then how it differs from private universities that you may see on the East Coast. And so I think that's where you have to assess programs differently given their location. So as Laureen said, the strike was based on a desire to make education relevant, especially to the communities from which the students came from. And I'm just a little bit younger than Laureen. And so, she laughed. So I wasn't raised in Chinatown, but I went to Chinatown weekly. And I actually had Asian American Studies in high school because of that effort in the 1968. But you could see in the red line, we wanted the college to serve their communities, not to rescue students from their communities. And so it's very community-based. And so this is the way I conceive of it, that Asian American Studies was for, by, and about Asian Americans. It's about community change, liberation from racism, imperialism, and third world solidarity. You could see here, all the purposes are for the community, not necessarily for the individual student. And so that's a big difference, focusing on community change rather than helping an individual's identity or their upward mobility. It's by Asian Americans, which is really different from the Eurocentric perspective you would get in other disciplines, right? You would have a unique Asian American voice, creating our own literatures, i.e. was the first anthology created by my office mate, having a decolonized perspective and using, for me, my last book, I used Chinese terms to understand religion rather than a Judeo-Christian framework, right? That's how we're trying to understand our community from when we have authors and scholars from the community. And the topics we research are different, not as objects of study, but as our own issues that we're dealing with, our own history, like Laureen talked about, her family's background, our own perspective. So it is a different discipline from other academic disciplines. And coming out of San Francisco State, being community-based, one of the programs was this 9-unit block class where students actually spend time organizing in the community and then sort of reflected it in class. And you could see here in this list of 8 people from that initial class, we actually had 2 department heads in the city, a school president, and then 5 nonprofit directors coming out of that first group of students taking Asian American studies. And if you say they're failures, I would argue, no, they established our Asian American communities, led community development efforts, and then not only helped the Asian American community, but helped at least San Francisco's government and our university systems. So these people come out of Asian American studies with a perspective of community change, a desire to liberate everybody and to work in solidarity with others. But, and then what happened though, as Laureen talked about, is as we tried to get legitimated in our institutions, we began to differ. San Francisco State is more of a teaching university, whereas the UCs are more research oriented. So given those different institutional aims, we developed a lot of classes to teach Asian American studies as general education requirements. UC and Berkeley focus more on the research, publishing, and getting their faculty tenure. And so you could see the shifts and the quick differences over time. We teach a lot more classes. We have over 60 classes at San Francisco State each semester. We teach like 3,000 students. We have classes specializing on environmental justice, Filipino American literature, Asian American sexuality. We're pretty specific and narrow in our topic. So if Asian American studies is about teaching issues pertinent and relevant to our community, I think at San Francisco State, we've accomplished that we actually teach not only Asian students, but a large part of the student body about the Asian American experience, especially in comparison to African American experience, the mainstream white. Berkeley, you could see, hasn't been able to grow as much, and they shifted towards an Asian American and Asian diaspora framework. That's in order to get academic legitimacy to connect to the transnational ties we have with Asia. UCLA is successful because they have joint appointments. So you have a lot of Asian American faculty in sociology, public health, and they align themselves with the faculty and the other departments. They don't have as many classes as we do, but they have a more robust research program that's applied, and they could focus on Asian American topics. So you could see the differentiation. And I'm not saying one program is better than the other, we're just different given our institutional arrangements. Overall, what's happened is a big shift in Asian American studies, and this might be the failure, that we're not as community-based. Again, we started off with the politics of identity, being concerned with racism and imperialism and its impact on the community. How do we disrupt white supremacy? And what's shifted over time is we've gone to identity politics, where we're really concerned about representation and the individual identity. I hear students from East Coast schools complain, oh, we're invisible, and all they care about is the model minority stereotype. That's such a narrow issue. Like, you don't see poor Asian Americans being trafficked or dealing with, homelessness, worried about being the minority. But if that's a particular concern of more middle-class students in upper or elite type schools. So the identities are really different because we've clearly become more diverse, right? So Asian American Studies has institutionalized, and if you want to be established in a private school, right, that's a whole different, private schools are reproduce the status quo. They want to reproduce their elitism. They want to reproduce their status. And so clearly Asian Americans going to those schools will get institutionalized into that status quo of white supremacy. And if that's success, congratulations, you've made it in America as a model minority. That's what Asian American Studies has done. We've made it in some places. We get 1 or 2 faculty in these elite universities, and then we have a conference, and what we're trying to do is we become very academic. We want to develop a professional standard of excellence in research and teaching. So we have book awards. We become very academic, very theoretical. I don't understand 90% of what's said at these Asian American Studies conferences because I don't understand the jargon. It's inaccessible. And I got a PhD from Berkeley. I don't know how connected it is to the community, but for those people, they made it. So they're successful, so we should congratulate them. So quickly, how much time do I have, Franklin?
This is good. This is good. About 2 minutes.
Okay. So the barriers to development of Asian American Studies in terms of being a community-based discipline is that for intellectual legitimacy, you have to publish or perish, right? And that takes a lot of time to write, to do good research, to write well, and then to get published. And so that you gain respect and status from your fellow academic peers who also talk in that inaccessible jargon. It takes a lot of work. So you don't have time to do community organizing. You don't even have time to even pay attention to what's going on in the community because you're in your own little narrow box talking about, whatever interests. Again, if you're in a joint appointment, which is where most Asian American faculty are, they have 2 disciplines, Asian American Studies and maybe, let's say, anthropology. They have to meet all the demands of anthropology. They have to do a service commitment to the anthropology department. They may have to go to anthropology conferences. So they're straddling 2 worlds, and it's hard to do both. And so usually they straddle their academic discipline because that's where they get status, that's where they get tenure, that's where they get promotion. The status is really big in academia. That's what they care about, is just, having your name up there. And the other problems with Asian American Studies, students say they want it, but they never take the classes because they think, what am I going to do with an Asian American Studies degree, right? And so they say they want it, they fight for it, a few people fight for it, but nobody takes the classes. And if there's no class demand for it, schools aren't going to provide it. And of course, it's really difficult to find faculty to teach these classes. So these are the barriers in Asian American Studies. I just want to close by saying, I think at San Francisco State, we have a range. Some of our faculty are really trying to make it in academia and trying to write good theoretical work and getting published in Parish. Some really focus on being really good teachers. And if you want to be a great teacher, that takes a lot of effort, right? And then some continue to try to do a lot of community work. And so to try to do all 3 well, teaching well, publishing well, and then doing community work is even more difficult, right? So I would say at the CSU, we have the worst of all, that we have to publish, we have to work in the community, and we have to be good teachers. I have 130 students this semester. I don't have any TAs. I have to grade all of them. And I don't assign multiple choice because I think that's a lousy way to teach. At the same time, we co-founded Stop API Hate, right? And we've seen in the last 2 weeks, the spate of violence against our Asian American elderly. So I have 5 interviews every day trying to talk about our community's issues, trying to get legislators to develop policies to address it, trying to work with other communities of color to build solidarity. And so it's really, really difficult, but for me, it's what Asian American Studies is supposed to be about, right? Laureen talked about self-determination. It's having leaders in our community speaking about the issues of our community in ways that are accessible to both building the movement within our community and then being perhaps spokespersons to the broader mainstream community. And it's just really, really hard. And I don't know if we're successes or failures, but again, I've been indoctrinated by Laureen and Franklin and the original model of Asian American Studies to be community-based. I think for me, it's a calling, it's a real honor and a privilege, and I don't take it lightly, that here I am, one of the few people with a paid position to be a professional Asian American. And so I'm going to be that professional Asian American for my community. I'm going to stay grounded in the community. I live in a low income community. And my students remind me, like whenever I get too haughty, like I'm going to be on NBC, I think about my students and how I have to grade their papers. And I hold both. And I keep my students at the forefront because they remind me what we're about empowering a community that's struggling, empowering a community that needs voice, and empowering a community that has a lot to say, that isn't invisible, that isn't unheard. Because if you listen to us, we have a lot to say and we have lots to see. Thanks.
Yep, that's great, Russell. Thank you. So I think you need to stop the share.
Yeah, okay, I'll do that.
That's great. So that brings us to a really different kind of experience at William and Mary. Dinesh Sohoni is professor of sociology and director of the Asian Pacific Islander American APIA Studies program at William and Mary. So this is really one of the very different kinds of institutions. His research examines the significance of race, ethnicity, nativity, and citizenship in social institutions such as education, the military, marriage, media, and law, which is a lot. His work has been published in such journals as Social Forces, Social Problems, Sociology of Education, Law and Society Review, the Asian American Law Journal, and Ethnic and Racial Studies. Professor Sohoni regularly teaches classes on race, immigration, demography, and law. He also serves as the co-chair of the Asian Centennial at William and Mary, commemorating 100 years of Asian American Studies at William and Mary. Welcome, Dinesh, and you're on.
Thank you, Franklin. I'd like to thank the 1882 Foundation for hosting this and letting me represent the APIA program at William and Mary. I'd also like to thank this fantastic audience. I've been paying attention to the chats for taking the time on Sunday to dialogue with us on this important topic. And also a shout out to my William and Mary students and the William and Mary alumni who I was seeing on the chat. I wanted to talk a little bit about a tiny bio in terms of my academic bio. I studied sociology with a focus on demography at University of Washington, where I got my PhD. But at Santa Barbara, I was Asian studies, not Asian American studies. And so I'm going to talk about how this affected the development of the program, or its relationship to the development of the program at William and Mary. I'm currently the APIA Studies Director, and also, as Franklin noted, just last week we formally set up the Asian Centennial at William and Mary, and I wanted to finish by talking about that. But my role here is kind of representing program building on the East Coast. And so I wanted to kind of Russell, thanks for your slides on the size of those programs, because we have a very different kind of context at William and Mary. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that. So brief overview, we are a very new program. APIA officially became a program in 2016. And before that, there were lots of students who were very involved in Asian American studies, but they had to design their own major. So they basically were a self-designed major, and then on the side of their diploma, it said Asian American Studies. And only 2 years ago did the Faculty of Arts and Science approve APIA as a major and minor under Global Studies. And that's where we're at right now. Between 2009 and 2019, when we became an official major, we graduated around 2 students per year, a little under 2 students. In 2020, we had our first 4 majors under the new APIA major. And we are growing very rapidly, and in the next 3 classes, we already have 18 declared major, and some of them are here today. So we're a rapidly growing program, but this is where I think the East Coast, West Coast difference start to manifest. So currently we only have 2 faculty who are basically officially APIA faculty. And we have, both of those are joint appointments. One is in theater and one is theater and APIA, and the other is English and APIA. So we're very reliant basically on faculty across the university who are willing to put Asian American content within their classes. And so we have now affiliate faculty in anthropology, in AIMS, which is our Asian Middle Eastern Studies, English, history, psychology, sociology, theater. And these are faculty who, as Russell has already mentioned, in a professional capacity, they're rewarded within their own disciplines. So everything that they're doing for us is kind of their generosity in creating content for us, because most of their rewards fall within their own majors. Second, we also need the willingness of the departments to allow these faculty to teach in our program. And so this is where I wanted to talk about this support that we have and the challenges we face uniquely as kind of a smaller program on the East Coast that doesn't have this long history of Asian American activism, Asian American populations, Asian American communities. So William & Mary is a state school, so 60% of our students have to come from Virginia. And the population of Asian Americans in Virginia is around 5%. And of that, I think around 1/3 are US born. And so when students are coming into William & Mary, not all of them have a extensive exposure to Asian American history, Asian American communities. And so we actually have to do a lot of recruitment to maintain our major. So students don't naturally go to APIA. We reach out to many of the student groups on campus. And so APIA was really student faculty driven, where the university is supportive when we say we want to do things, but basically we have to initiate and push. We had to initiate and push to have this. And so students and staff, students and my colleague, Francis Tangla Aguas, were very involved in creating the structure and then going to the university and saying, here we have this structure, can we have support for this? And with, like I said, with many of the Northern Virginia students who make up a large part of our student body, they come in with little exposure to that history that you would expect. I grew up in Southern California, and so that exposure to larger communities, exposure to some of this, at least more in the present in your high schools and junior high school and so forth, is somewhat missing. So a lot of the students in our class have not been exposed to any Asian American content when they take our classes. The other kind of challenge is that while all our faculty, affiliated faculty, are very supportive, it's a tenuous kind of support in the sense that if any of them retire, the line belongs to the department and they can choose to use it any way. And it means that we are always trying to find new faculty who might be interested in creating content, because we're never guaranteed. We only have 2 half lines is our all we have in APIA. And so even if we lose those 2 lines, English or theater could choose how they would want to go about. So we have to do a lot of working with students, working with faculty, working with the university, and trying to build this in a way that we can try to maintain long-term. And so that, I think that's one challenge that probably is a little bit more unique for a smaller college. We have 7,000 students, and one that doesn't have this long history of these type of programs. I also really like this question, although it kind of was a challenging question, which is, have Asian American Studies programs succeeded? And I'm going to take the viewpoint from our program to answer this question. And I would argue that it depends on what we see as success. And there's so many different ways to measure success. And when we think about it, one of the things that we can ask is helping raise awareness about Asian American history and struggles among Asian American students and communities in a safe place versus educating non-Asian American groups. And this is something that on our campus, the William and Mary is very active in trying to incorporate social justice into course content, but frequently the default is to look at ethnic studies programs or gender women's studies programs to do the work of this attempt to create social justice. But from our program standpoint, the question is, when we have an Asian American Studies class, are we interested in educating Asian American students who might not have had that history in a place where they can talk about this? Or do we think about other non-Asian American, I mean, basically white majority who might be taking the class to meet a course requirement that they aren't necessarily invested in? And this is not to say, in my classes tend to be, Asian American Studies classes tend to be very diverse, but it's they're selecting in because they're not getting specific credit. And that can change the format of how the class is when it's a required class. And then you might have students who are only doing it for the requirement and not because of that interest. The second kind of comparison is one that Russell also raised, which is, are we trying to create Asian American Studies as an academic discipline, or should it be social community activism? And given that a lot of our faculty are outside of Asian American Studies, they have those disciplinary responsibilities that tend to be research focused. And so it's a lot easier to try to recruit senior faculty versus new junior faculty who might be very excited, but we're concerned about, you know, the tenure parish, publisher parish kind of model. And so we have that kind of challenge of that as an academic discipline with us, is that we're not getting people who are Asian American Studies trained. We're getting people who are interested in Asian American content, but they have to do it within their own disciplinary boundaries that reward certain types of things. Yet we're still able to maintain community activism. A lot of our students do honors theses. A lot of our students actually work for the 1882 Foundation. So a lot of our students actually were very involved in helping other schools in Virginia try to develop Asian American Studies programs. So these are not mutually exclusive, but there are these kind of unique pressures that we have faced.
Okay.
Sorry,
Yes.
how many,
Another
am I almost
minute?
over? Can I have 2 more minutes?
Yes.
Okay, so similar to what other people have talked about, if we're looking at our successes, I think that if we're trying to put pressure on Asian American Studies to create a just world, that's way too much pressure for these type of programs. But what we can do is try to help create the people who are going to go out there and do that. And I just wanted to kind of share that we're starting the Asian American Centennial at William and Mary for a 100-year anniversary. And 2 of the big things that we're trying to do tie into some of these issues. We're working with the School of Education, and we're hoping to work with the Virginia Department of Education to try to create K-12 curricula and make that more inclusive and incorporate that into that type of curricula. So we see this kind of attempt to create activism through this new project that we're engaged in. So thank you very much for your letting me run over, and I will end here.
Okay, thanks, Dinesh. This is all really very interesting, I think. And we had some time for just conversing amongst ourselves, but I think we should open this up pretty much to the audience and the chat for, because I think a lot of the questions that we might have of one another might be things that could be brought up from the chat room, from the audience at large. I would only want to interject as prerogative of the moderator. I remember Laureen's generation. I was in 1969. I was 30 years old exactly, and I'd been trained in Asian studies I was ABD, all but dissertation. So my career trajectory was studying China and Japan. Basically, my dissertation was on feudalism in Japan. So moving into Asian American studies was a huge transition, a jolt. But I remember, well, I mentioned 30 because one of the things Laureen might remember, there was a big saying that you can't trust anyone over 30, because this was a youth movement, and anybody over 30 was too inclined to be interested in career and tenure and maintaining the status quo. And a lot of the people I worked with were interested in really overthrowing the system. So in terms of revolutionary aims, clearly Asian American studies, in terms of participating in a complete revolution, failed. That's pretty clear. In terms of pursuing social justice, I think a lot of the people who came out of Asian American studies did a lot of things, as Russell, I think the one slide indicating just what the original classes of folks who went on to found or become heads of social service agencies. I mean, a lot of that stuff is replicated across the country. So in that sense, I think even social justice concerns were not, those goals were not necessarily a failure. Anyway, let me turn it over to our folks who are trying to sift out things from the chat room.
Yeah, so you feel free to start dropping your questions into the chat. I'll just read them out loud for our panel. I just want to bring up a few questions that were asked earlier during the presentations. First one is from Michael Che Kim. I think this has sort of been a theme throughout all the presentations, but maybe like just to make explicit the answer to this question as the speakers see it. Michael asked, as the history of Asian Americans on the West Coast differs from the East Coast, are there any noticeable differences between Asian American studies on East Coast campuses versus West Coast campuses? I think, I guess the contrast has been sort of like hinted at, but if anyone has like any direct points they would want to make about that from our speakers, or Franklin.
Well, Dinesh, I mean, you've been on both coasts. What would you say? What's a short answer to that?
Well, the short answer, I think, is just, for me, just the amazing variety of communities and kind of the awareness. So most of the faculty who helped, Francis Tanglao Aguas was our first director and was instrumental in setting up the program. And our most recent hire, Bene Farao, all of us are Bruins. And so we all kind of, we're trying to bring that kind of West Coast mentality to the East Coast, but then coming to the East Coast and not having that kind of expectation of certain types of awareness. But on the flip side, it took me a little while to also recognize that there are Asian communities and they had different histories on the East Coast, and to start becoming aware of that, those kind of distinct histories is something that I'm starting to try to learn. But I think that activism on the West Coast that started all these programs, we can't take it for granted on the East, and in a sense we're East Coast, and in a sense we're recreating and trying to create that kind of similar thing that was occurring in the West Coast.
Okay, see you next time. Okay, you got your shaver? Yep. Okay.
So,
I also think that we shouldn't compare in that sense, because I think what we've been good at is that whatever we termed as revolutionary became evolutionary. Things had to evolve. And I think that's the same in terms of our programs, like he just said, Denise just said, it's like the East Coast frame is different than us. And what would be interesting is that what is it from our perspective can be taken to be replicated or to be thrown away or to be analyzed so that other people can use it. We always have templates in terms of how to evolve. And I think that at best we are a template in terms of the West Coast, but it's not an answer for everyone in every aspect.
yeah, I want to turn to Russell, but first mention that maybe the closest to SF State kinds of student community relations is UMass Boston. I'm not sure.
I've heard of that, yes.
And then you have closer to Berkeley would be the kind of high-powered intellectual resources that a place like Yale University can boast, with people like Lisa Lowe and Gary and Okihiro and Mary Louie. The different kinds of resources that come to bear. Amherst College, where I teach now, and I've been there for 6 years after having been mostly a bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. So my vision of doing community work was at the national level. So I still thought of myself as doing community work, except my community was National Association of Journalists, the journalists, the Smithsonian Institution in terms of making inroads, and government agencies and that sort of thing. But I thought that was a useful thing to do, that was necessary. Russell, what do you think?
Yeah, well, it's clear East Coast, West Coast. If you're from the South, which has a burgeoning Asian American community, or the Midwest, the geographical critical mass of Asian Americans really does make a difference in both what you can teach and how, like Dinesh talked about, how aware students are of their own Asian American identity, how much they've had to assimilate into a white mainstream culture. In the West Coast, you adapt and you grow up in an Asian dominated culture where everybody's drinking boba, right? Everybody's watching K-pop. So, Asian Americans are the class leaders, the student athletes, and everything. And so it's a really different context, and they have a different racial awareness. And they have also different racial solidarities, whether they identify as people of color or where they want to become like the white kids around them. So it is, we've really diversified, and we have to acknowledge that. But I still think the commitment to empowering the Asian American community can be sort of the roots and overall purpose of every, Asian American studies program. And then you just, like Laureen says, evolve it given your context, given your students, given what type of faculty you have. But really, the institutional framework does shape the ability to evolve. The institutional context of what the goal of the university is, like you just said, whether it's a Yale versus if you're a teaching university, it's really, really different.
Mm-hmm.
And that's my primary worry now, given the recent events on the rise of hate crimes towards Asian Americans and from other communities of color. At this point, it's like visually, it seems like it's African American versus, against the Asian American community. And while I understand what you're saying, Franklin, it's just like teaching a state. I felt I was serving my community, because the students were my community, and I had to help them manage and deal with their lives as well as academically, as well as at home and stuff. But then I worry about how our jobs has taken away where the most vulnerable in our community, the least educated, the ones that aren't making it past high school at best, and don't have the luxury of going to college and hearing Asian or Black studies or whatever, their perceptions of each other. How are we reaching the everyday people that are underserved in K-12 in terms of the issues they have with other people of color. You know, that was more accessible and, you know, talking points even within college, our College of Ethnic Studies, right? Now, you know, a pandemic doesn't help, but that is an issue. This hasn't gone away. It started when my husband did, AKA Don Bonus, when Vietnamese people moved into Sunnydale housing and Blacks would steal their things. And hey, man, my cousin just took your TV. You want to come over and watch? You know, I mean, that kind of tension has not disappeared in our respective communities. And yet I feel that that's the question that's being posed on us today. Aside from what Russell is doing, which is a very important piece of work because data is always important, it is like reaching to the root of how we solve the problem.
Thank you to the speakers and Franklin for your responses to that question. I guess sort of the next topic, Ted, as well as Baldwin Chu and Larissa Lamb sort of asked questions that I think go together. So Ted is basically asking, would the goals of Asian American Studies be better served by content development for K through 12 grade social studies programs instead of creating Asian American Studies at the university level? And Baldwin Chu and Larissa Lamb asked how we can better incorporate Asian American Studies into, you know, quote unquote, regular American history at the K through 12 level.
Definitely. I mean,
Wow.
Russell, you know the new law in California, you know, for K-12 and what we've done in K-12.
Yeah, in California, there's a big fight. So it's not required yet, but they're establishing model ethnic studies curriculum for K through 12. But there's a big battle over what constitutes ethnic studies. Do we use the racial approach that came out of San Francisco State, focusing on like 4 or 5 main racial groups and really focusing on racism and racial solidarity and racial change, versus a social justice approach, which is more broad, more focused on ethnicities that can encompass other groups that include Jewish populations or LGBTQ issues or disabilities. And so it's a real political fight going on right now of what constitutes ethnic studies. Again, similar to this conversation, what's the aim of it? And then what should be taught to our students? So overall, the overall movement for ethnic studies curriculum K through 12, I think is growing, especially as Black Lives Matter pushes the need to, you know, develop racial empathy. And I think it is significant. It shifts, again, the focus of ethnic studies going K through 12 versus being at a higher ed thing. It's really hard. Like, how do you make American history based on like the people of color's history, right? Or women's history. And so the point of view, I mean, you could look at history, you teach it in a whole bunch of different ways, a class view of history. And I think students now, actually in California, my kid, he's a boy, 3 boys just led workshops on intersectionality. So that's how, in some ways, an academic idea like intersectionality, where we're impacted mutually by race, class, and gender, is now filtered down to high school boys who understand their intersectional oppressions and their identity, their privilege and their disadvantages, are sharing that with others. So that in some ways, it's getting down there, at least in California, where, you know, we use pronouns and we're intersectional and we're very, very alert to these issues.
Yeah.
Or maybe that's just the Bay Area in our small.
I think that's a national, not just a need, but beginnings of a trend of just one example. I'm involved in a group called Tsuru for solidarity. Tsuru in Japanese means crane. So in the Japanese American community, there is some movement to try to link the World War II incarceration experience as a form of racist oppression and incarceration, and trying to link that to morally and politically with the kinds of policies that have been used to separate and detain families at the borders, with intended refugees or with incarceration in the country as a whole. So there's there are some ways in which production of knowledge or distribution of knowledge that's usually seen as the domain of higher education. I mean, it's still, I think, a responsibility that we have as educators in higher education institutions to make sure that gets passed to, for example, K-12 teachers who don't have time to be generating the materials for distribution and learning, that we have a responsibility to try to help them incorporate some of the findings that we have generated into their classrooms. So that's, I think, a really hopeful thing that generating ethnic studies in K-12 or Cal State system would help. Dinesh.
Yeah, I want to build on, Franklin, what you just said. So like the question originally started about more Asian American studies programs in higher ed versus K-12 education. And like Franklin, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. So with, we're celebrating the centennial at William and Mary, but that centennial, the first Chinese student who arrived was 1922, but they were able to come here, but at the same time, it'd be 30 more years until African-American students were allowed onto campus. And so those are the kind of stories that we can research and try to figure out how to tell those stories and get that down to the K-12 level, because I don't, as Franklin said, K-12 teachers are so busy that they don't have time to do this type of research. They're not supported to do this type of research. But those kind of stories about how inclusion of Asian Americans at William and Mary was paired with exclusion of African Americans is an interesting story. The other thing is, like, where did these students live? Because they, in Virginia at the time, you had the Jim Crow laws of housing segregation. So how did Asian and Asian American students navigate the spaces of a bifurcated legal system that was black-white in Virginia? And I think that the higher education can look at those stories, and if we can tell those stories in ways that we can transmit down to the K-12, I think we're doing our job.
The whole K-12 movement is not a new one. I mean, it began in the 70s, at least in California. And there were a host of ethnic minority educators that sat on numerous state committees as well as local committees to even try and change or infuse curriculum into our history and social science for young all the way up to middle school. What was very interesting is that, you know, this whole deal could be different now because, you know, Black Lives Matter kind of like exposed what has not been done in 50 years, right? And so maybe it's more timely that we not only try and give the materials to the teachers, what's important is the publishers of these books, of the history books that get sold to K-12 is all about money making. And it's all about, quote unquote, their thing is like serving the entire USA position. And therefore, you know, assuming people in Middle America have no interest on who and how we came to be as Asian and much less other ethnic groups, and which right now may be the wrong assumption. So working with publishers as educators from the IHEs all the way down to K-12 as a core in terms of getting a wider perspective of history, and then leaving up to the people who are in pedagogy to decide how to teach it is a force that was done in the 70s, but got stopped in 80s with Reagan and the whole other agenda that came about after that. So people, I think, need to recognize that this is another pivotal time of the politics of changing the, quote, the resources we use to teach, quote unquote, who we want to be, you know, in our K-12 curriculum.
Linda, can I make a comment? I'm sorry that I'm coming late into this Zoom meeting because I came from another one. But OCA National When we run our outreach to the high school students, it turns out we chronicle the milestones and the achievements of the Asians through history, because we've made contributions in America. So therefore, it turns out, would it not seem appropriate that 1882 Foundation and so many of you do recognize that the achievements and milestones, contributions made by the Asians is a part of history. It's a part of American history. So indeed, I think having it become a part of the K-12 curriculum is not out of line. I mean, any other ethnic group, immigrants that have come to this country would certainly want to have that same recognition that we too have made milestone achievements and accomplishments in the American history books. So, I really do respect that OCA National and other community-based organizations are actually doing some level of, we have this half-day session with high school students to chronicle all the achievements and milestones of Asians through history. And then we move into community activism. We talk about what can we do in terms of having the voice of the Asian community realized. So there's a lot of good movement. I'm pleased that OCA National, with the chapters across the country, are actually addressing K-12 curriculums. And then down in Richmond and down in Michigan, there are efforts in terms of actually the gathering, the researching of information that actually lends itself to maybe becoming part of the K-12 curriculum. So I'm pleased that there is movement from OCA.
Thank you, Mary. Yes, I think those are really important points, and there are movements that are going on across the country at many different levels and in different arenas. The contribution part, you know, one of the key issues confronting certainly East Coast universities, Asian American students at elite universities are trying to combat notions of the model minority, and I think largely because what they're finding is that their administrations and some of the faculty and their peers are using the model minority myth as leverage against their being able to study their own experiences and histories, and that they resent a great deal. I'm not sure how if this is something that you're facing on the West Coast, Russell.
That is being used against them, quote unquote. Is that what you're saying? Yes.
Yes, you are finding that as well.
Yes, I mean, you know, it's easy, you know. That's why, you know, those of us who understand that phenomenon, that stereotype well, and, you know, basically have to call people on it and say that, you know what, that stereotype was not created by us. It's created by you people here, so that you can act as a wedge to divide us, you know, by doing one very specific thing you're trying to do is to not let other people know about our struggles and how it's similar to others. Simple. So are you going to help us stop that wedge, or are you going to continue it by using it against us? You know, it's that whole thing of being acceptable but not accepted. You know, it's just something that we're not. I think those of us who are in positions of power or in positions that are more privileged, we don't necessarily always combat it, you know, in a way that is not, you know, not meaning to sever relationships, but in a way that we want a real fruitful kind of conversation where it moves us forward away from it.
Just quickly, can I chime in? I think the perpetual foreigner stereotype is much more dangerous at the moment. You know, we swing from being model minority inside in the US versus the racialized outsiders as a perpetual foreigner. And in this moment, we're outsiders, threats, seen as exotic, different disease carriers. And that's why we're getting racially profiled. That's why our elderly are getting attacked. All groups are attacking us because we're seen as being outside others who are not even human enough so that people could cough and spit, push and shove us. It's really, really dangerous. It's killing people. So that stereotype is way more dangerous than the model minority stereotype, I think.
Mhm.
There's the whole notion of Christian nationalism, that America should be a white Christian nation. And that framework has really led people to have racist views about Black Lives Matter, about people detained at the border, and about Asians not being able to migrate, not being able to reunify, not being able to use their WeChat. So for me, exploring the perpetual foreigner status, and Asians don't like to, they sort of like the model minority because it actually, it's sort of
Benefits them,
positive.
yes.
Yeah, it actually feeds into their, yeah, well, we are sort of hardworking and good. Nobody wants to adopt a real, like, oh, am I really foreign? Am I really excluded? Am I really seen as other? And so it's harder for Asian Americans to accept that stereotype, to realize that others think that of them, but it has much more insidious, dangerous policies and interpersonal violence as a result of it. So just being in the midst of Stop the API Hate, I see that as much more threatening, something that Asian American studies should address much more than the model minority concern. Yes, they're related, but
Yeah.
again, for Asian Americans, they highlight model minority much more than the perpetual foreigner, because that's all they could relate to, is being the model minority. And that's like, it's the privileged stereotype that are impact a few people, really. But for working class Asian Americans, it's the outsider stereotype, not being able to speak the language well. That's what's really impacting them.
Thank you for.
And then,
oh,
I'm sorry. But Russell, so do you think that in terms of answering, how do you kind of educate people against that foreigner concept? What is hidden in that besides the pandemic, and what Trump said and whatever, causing us havoc here? Aside from that, that thing is also saying something else besides, the pandemic. What else is it saying as being a foreigner? That we exploit the system, that we don't deserve to have any of the benefits that we get here when we come here? What is it?
Because we're outsiders, we could be legally detained. We could be that's what happened after 9/11 of Islamophobia. We could be legally deported. That's happening to the Southeast Asian community. We have to realize 2/3 of the Asian American community are brown people. We have to adopt this brown identity more than a yellow identity. We could be, there's a China initiative that profiles Chinese scientists and researchers going on right now. It's legal to profile us, right? And so this outsider stereotype, the yellow peril fear, is actually operational in a lot of policies and then in our interpersonal relations for people who are getting attacked. So actually, that's the book I would write about, yellow peril fears, Chinese exclusion, citizenship cases of thin, Japanese American incarceration, Islamophobia, COVID-19. It's a repeated, whenever racism hits high surges, Vincent Chin, it's because we're cast out as outsiders. It's not the model minority stereotype that's threatening us so much. They're not creating policies based, except for maybe affirmative action, on the model minority stereotype. But this yellow peril fear and that stereotype is really, really having negative impacts. I guess you do both. Again, there's sort of two sides of the same coin, but Asian Americans tend to, oh, we're the model minority. And that's so whiny to me. I'm just tired of it. And people aren't recognizing this other side of it.
And I think we need to acknowledge both so you don't split the community in terms of fighting, like which one is more oppressive than the other. Do you know what I'm saying? I agree. I don't disagree with you, but there is the whole thing of our own education that it wouldn't take that long, but it would need to be spoken to. That
I know some of this takes me just it's a little, some of this is like going back to the topic. Have we failed? It's like going back to the late 60s and 70s of yellow peril images of Fu Manchu and stuff like that. The Manchurian Candidate, that were so much in the public eye. So I guess Laureen has a good corrective for us to try to pay attention to all the stuff that's besieging our communities at this point. So, Dinesh, what are you finding at William and Mary?
Yeah, I think that, the model minority was getting a lot of play just because of the Harvard case and so forth, so affirmative action stuff. And so I think that with the type of students, we're a very selective college. I think that was one that was interesting to students, but I think that like in my classes, I teach the yellow peril and how model minority replaced it temporarily for certain types of practical reasons, and that it's always there with the potential to rise up, and that's what we're seeing at the present time. So I think that we have to teach about all of these type of things. But if you're asking what students are most aware of a certain type of stereotype, I think right now at William and Mary, when a lot of their other schools that they applied to were Ivy League schools and so forth, the affirmative action case spurred by Harvard was, is one that is a quick entry for some of the students on our campus. But I think that our faculty, we don't start with model minority. I don't think we start with that. And I don't think our students necessarily expect that, but they are coming just from applying to colleges. And so that's one that, and that gets back to that whole point of, a lot of the stuff that Asian American studies isn't directed towards refugee populations, the more impoverished populations on campuses, because our student bodies usually tend to be underrepresented in those, among those communities and so forth. So I try to teach about refugees and other types of stuff. And I think the students are very excited to kind of get that broader type of background on Asian Americans. So, I mean, that's just my more impressionist take.
So Linda, we only have a few minutes left. Are we gonna stick to our timetable?
Yeah, I know we only have a few minutes left. I think at this point, I do want to ask one more topic area very briefly, just because there were a few questions on it. But Kathy Fong and Melanie Manbury, they sort of had questions about, we have Asian American studies as an academic discipline, but applied to community activism. So Kathy Fong says she sees this as applied APIA studies, and they were wondering if there are any other departments that are doing this as well. And Melanie was wondering if any of the speakers have any advice for young Asian American community organizers in Chinatowns.
Wow.
I
Advice.
don't have enough time to talk about that, but whatever brief responses folks might have would be great. Also,
just a quick question. So there a lot of people have put very good information in the chat. Can those references be? Do we still have access to those references after the event is over? Can we still access the chat when we do the recordings?
Yeah, our communications team is going to save all of them in case anybody needs that. But yeah.
Okay, so any advice for young organizers?
Can I jump in?
Sure.
Franklin, I was going to ask the same question about saving the stuff, because there's a lot of really good stuff in the chat for K-12. And if we're talking about what we should be doing, you guys are a resource for kind of collecting some of the information that a lot of people are sharing with you. So I'd love to be able to kind of have the information from the chat where people are providing a lot of resources.
Okay, great. So Russell and Laureen.
Well, I wanted a clarification on the question. Was the question about community organizing? What are they asking specifically? What do they do in community organizing? How do they get into it? What's the?
So I think it's sort of a general question, as I see it, of if you guys could speak a little bit briefly on, I guess, Asian American studies as applied to activism and organizing. Yeah.
Well, I think that if your interest is to bring back skills to a community you want to be involved with, and therefore because you want to serve it. I would see that the most important piece is to be in that, or be in an organization and be there for a while as either a volunteer, or if you can get some support to be there financially, that would be great. But not to use it as something that you're doing for your class, like I have to write a paper. So therefore you go interview a couple of people and then you write a paper and then you get a great grade and not do anything with the community agency. If you want to be activist, you first have to feel something for an issue that you want to be involved with. And if there's a community agency that speaks to that, then you need to spend time to understand it and to work with the people that work with it, as well as the clients they serve. It's a time commitment thing. And it's I guess, kind of your heart in terms of being committed to it, to spend that effort.
Russell.
Yeah, I think there are some applied fields if you get a graduate degree. So you could do public policy, urban planning, public health, counseling, social welfare. So I think there are programs where they integrate Asian American perspectives and how to better address and serve Asian American communities. You got to look for the faculty who deal with it, and then they can give you that training. For organizing, I think actually you learn by doing and working with unions or political advocacy groups are the way to go to learn organizing skills. I know there's a network of Asian American organizers and Seeding Change through Chinese Progressive Association. So these just sort of train themselves, and they're much more applied. They're probably cutting edge transformative justice perspectives that you don't get in schools. And sadly, there is that split between academic approaches to social change and social movements versus what the organizers are doing. And so, at San Francisco State, I know UCLA, we try to bridge it as much as possible, but I think for organizing and activism, you learn it by doing, and then maybe you take some time in school to reflect what worked, can we share what worked, and then you go back and do it. And I think that sort of dialectical process is how we're trying to do praxis.
Mm-hmm. Linda, how are we doing?
Yeah, I think this is a good point to sort of wrap up our event. If anyone didn't have their questions answered, I encourage you to stay and hang out afterwards. But I just want to take this time to thank all of you for coming and participating in the chat and asking great questions. I also really want to thank our speakers and Franklin for your incredible presentations and moderating. And I don't know, Ted, if you want to add on to this, but after our events, we usually do have like a little bit of time for everyone. You can just like unmute and sort of more like a free flow discussion for anyone who wants to stay on after.
Yeah, so I'm Ted Gong, I'm director of the 1882 Foundation. And I want to thank Linda for a wonderful program. She's been organizing it for some time, I think, with a lot of thought. Franklin, of course, is always great to have you as our perpetual advisor and senior. And thank Denise and Russell and Laureen and everyone else who has participated in this very important conversation. And I think it's a continuing one. I think several people, Mary, other people have mentioned that the OCA Initiative on Educational Affairs, which is also something 1882 and the Chinese American Citizens Alliance have launched or we've been doing for about 6 months to look at Asian American studies across the United States, has an interesting title of the state of, or trying to find the status of what's going on in terms of Asian American studies, particularly related to K-12 grade. So those things that are happening in California, which Russell has mentioned, those are on our mind. We're looking at different things such as how do we fit Asian American studies content into very crowded K-12 grade curriculum. And those are some of the practical challenge you are looking for. Yes, theoretically, we want them in. The question is that as the teachers are teaching to standards of learning, how do you squeeze that extra ethnic studies program or the ethnic studies bit into an already overcrowded plate of things they have to teach? And there are ways to do that. I think that if you're going to teach government, you should find Chinese American examples to explain how separation of powers or how the Supreme Court works. Those things are all there. And it's up to us, I think, in Asian American studies and public educators to develop the material for these teachers to have and to point them out to stuff which you guys organize to help them understand the history, and in many cases, even just know what the history is. So those are all good things that are happening and they're continuing. We'd like to see that moving forward. So what we're going to do, usually the 1882 Foundation has a hangout period. We give those guys that want to escape an opportunity to escape. And then those guys that want to hang around, just chat, unmute yourself and just sort of like continue the chat on the chat box. And also just talk about anything you want to for the next 50 minutes. Is that a good time, Linda, for us to do that? And we're open it. There's a lot of people here that you know, many people know, and maybe some other people you would like to know. So give them all a shout out. Our next Talk Story event is going to be on March 8th. I think Richard Louis has a new book on selflessness, and we'll be doing a program where he'll be talking about that book and the significance of that to his own personal life and to what a movement that he wants to, I think I can call it a movement, where he wants to talk about how do we incorporate self